It's my pleasure to introduce Carl Jones. Carl is the chief scientist of the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust. This is a foundation established in 1963 by the late Gerald Durrell, and we're very fortunate to have Lee Durrell here this evening, the honorary director. Carl has a diverse portfolio in field biology, ecology, conservation, and management. He's been working with the Durrell Conservation Trust for 37 years, and he first visited Mauritius in 1979. Some of his early studies focused on the pink pigeon, and of course the Mauritius kestrel that we'll hear about. These are two species endemic to Mauritius and not found anywhere else. The mission of the Durrell Trust is saving species from extinction, and this, I think, also characterizes the career of Carl Jones. He combines diverse field techniques which are driven by the conviction that understanding the ecology and field biology of a species is essential to conserving it. Dr. Jones is also a visiting professor in ecology and evolution at the University of East Anglia, and he's also the scientific director of the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation. He has supervised a number of PhD and master's theses, and together with his students, he is really the point person for conservation in Mauritius. We're delighted to have him. Let's give him hearty congratulations for his receipt of the 2016 Indianapolis Prize.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Scott. It's lovely to be here this evening. It's a great pleasure. I've been here before a number of years ago because in the collections of this wonderful museum, there are actually a number of specimens from Mauritius. And I did a world tour 20 years ago to try and look at all the Mauritian specimens. And there was a very famous American consul to Mauritius in the 1860s called Nicholas Pike. And he collected lots of specimens. And they now reside here. And in fact, the only skeletons of the Mauritius kestrel in the world are here. You didn't know that now, did you? Anyway, I've won the Indianapolis Prize this year, which was a huge surprise to me, as well as a great honor. And I never thought that the work that I do in Mauritius would earn such a prestigious award, because I work on species that few of you will ever have heard of. Obscure reptiles, pink pigeons, golden bats, and so on. And some of the previous recipients have worked with far more familiar animals, such as pandas, gorillas, and elephants. But anyway, tonight I'm going to tell you about the work that I've been involved with, which I think is very important. Working on an island like Mauritius has given us the opportunity to work with critically endangered species, but also to learn how to manage populations that have gone down to small numbers, and to develop the techniques for restoring both populations and ecosystems. And I think it gives great hope for many other species. If we can save the world's rarest species, we can save others, but also many of the techniques that I'm going to talk about this evening are directly transferable. And I should also point out that the techniques that I've used for conserving birds in Mauritius were actually, many of them were developed here in North America on peregrine falcons and other species. And I think that one of the wonderful messages from the sorts of work that we do today is that many of these techniques are directly transferable. And I'm going to talk about the modest work I've done, but I think it's pointing a direction for what we can do in the future in terms of looking after endangered species, but also rebuilding systems. This is what I'm going to be concentrating on. Not so much details of individual conservation programs, but how species conservation can and does drive a much bigger agenda of whole system conservation. Now, this is actually quite an important distinction, because When I started my career as a conservation biologist, there was a major polemic. Do we put conservation resources into saving individual species, or do we put the resources into preserving habitat? And people are still arguing that. But I believe that actually when you work with species, it helps drive that much bigger agenda of working with habitats and systems. And if we look at some of the most effective and efficient conservation programs worldwide, you'll see they very often started very modestly with just 1 or 2 species. So that's the major thesis I'm going to be examining this evening. I work for the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust. It's an organization based in the Channel Islands of Britain. And it's an organization that was set up by the writer, naturalist, and zoo owner, Gerald Durrell. Gerald Durrell started his career as an animal collector, collecting animals for zoos. And he became disheartened that zoos were not fulfilling their full potential. In the 1950s, zoos were there to exhibit animals for people to come and see. And they weren't taking the responsibilities of being involved in conservation and research to the degree that Gerald Durrell felt they should be. So he set up his own zoo on the island of Jersey so he could concentrate on keeping and breeding endangered species and to work on the conservation of species. And he felt that when zoos work with critically endangered species, they should also be working with the species in the wild. Jerry Durrell lamented the demise of the dodo. The dodo, the most famous of all extinct animals, disappeared 1662 or soon thereafter. And he felt that if we'd been more responsible, we could have saved it, using captive breeding or by managing populations. The dodo has become the symbol of the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust. And because of our association with the dodo, it seemed fitting that one of our first field programs would be on the island of Mauritius. Mauritius is in the southwest Indian Ocean off the coast of Madagascar. It's a small oceanic island, and it's about 2,000 square kilometers. It's a very interesting island because it wasn't colonized by man until 1598, and we have a relatively complete ecological history of what's happened to the island. We know about the extinction of the dodo, but we also know about a lot of the other changes that have happened on the island. We know about some of the other extinct species. And what's interesting about islands is they've helped inform us about evolution, biogeography, but also today they're informing us about conservation. Some of our early successes in captive breeding and reintroductions were with island species, Hawaiian geese or Galapagos tortoises. But more recently on islands, we've been learning how to rebuild systems. This is work driven primarily by New Zealanders in the 1960s and 70s. And we're actually beginning to restore islands worldwide. So islands are important living laboratories to actually understand how systems function. And because islands are generally simpler systems than mainlands, it's easier to understand what's going on. So let's hope the work that I talk about tonight will in the future be replicated on mainland islands as well, as we learn more about restoring systems. This is an early illustration of Mauritius. It's a copy of a woodcut which dates from 1601. One of the first illustrations ever done of Mauritius. And I can't help looking at this without feeling really moved. I think there's so much information in there. Many of the rare and endangered species, there's the fruit bat, the echo parakeet, is a pink pigeon. And if you look carefully, you'll see the first ever illustration of a dodo, which is in the mid-right, walking towards the edge of the illustration. First known illustration of a dodo. So it's giving us a lot of information, but it's also showing how in the very first settlement, people were there exploiting the island. Taking the fish out of the sea, chopping down trees. And apparently, they're also rendering down tortoises. And the barrels are full of tortoise oil. So it's showing that the first colonizers saw the island as having unlimited resources, or so they thought. But of course, they weren't unlimited, and the dodo disappeared. And over the years, human beings have destroyed a lot of the forest that once existed on Mauritius. If you actually look up Mauritius on Google and look at the pictures on the internet, it's always described as a tropical paradise, the place where you go on holiday or have your honeymoon. And indeed, it's a very beautiful island. But when you look at it through the eyes of an ecologist, you realize that actually it's a devastated system, as indeed are many oceanic islands. I'm now going to show you a series of maps that show forest cover at different dates. The black areas represent primary forest. The white areas are areas that have been cleared primarily for agriculture. I've looked at these maps hundreds of times, and they still move me when I see what destruction there has been. But what is really interesting is that Mauritius isn't one of the most extremely modified islands. There are many other islands worldwide that have been even more greatly damaged. And today, there are no oceanic islands left that are completely pristine. All have been modified to some extent or other by introduced species. So you see, today, we have tiny, tiny pockets of native forest, about 2% of the island. We do have some secondary forest, and of course there's some planted areas. But I think this just illustrates the degree of devastation. Small wonder that we have lost many wonderful creatures. These are some models of some of the other extinct species from Mauritius. You will see in the middle a beautiful browsing tortoise. You'll see a blue fruit pigeon, a flightless rail, a fruit bat, a large parrot, and a giant skink. As biologists, of course, we lament the loss of any species. When you lose a species, of course, you're losing a taxonomic unit, but you're also losing ecological function. And when you're a conservation biologist like myself, you always have to query what were the roles of these extinct species. And if we're trying to rebuild systems, how can we replicate the roles that these animals played? Some of these animals would have been important browsers, grazers, pollinators, seed dispersers. These interactions we can only guess about today. So as a conservation biologist, I work on saving individual species, but I also want to develop or rebuild systems. Rebuilding systems when we don't even know how the original systems function. So there's lots of interesting problems that we have to try and fathom out. However, yes, we've lost species in Mauritius, and we've lost some tremendous species, but we've still got wonderful endemic animals and plants on the island. These are just a small selection of some of the species that I've been working with. Reptiles, some of the birds, and the plants as well. There are over 300 species of endemic plants on Mauritius, and many of those are critically endangered. Some of the plants we work with are down to the last known individuals or the last population. So many interesting challenges. Okay, I went to Mauritius as a young man in my early 20s. There's a picture of me. I love showing this picture. It reminds me of my youth. And also there was a time when I spent all my time in the field just worrying about my animals and thinking about field work. And they were halcyon days. And when I went to Mauritius, I was very naive, and I thought, oh, I can go and save all the endangered species and rebuild systems. And although we've been able to do a lot of that work, it actually has taken many decades. I also show this picture because I'm a little bit vain, and it's good to have pictures of myself in the talk. But anyway, as a young man, I kept birds. I was very interested. Well, I was very interested in all aspects of biology, but in my back garden, I kept birds. And there were waifs and strays that I found. And when I was still a schoolboy, I had kestrels. These were common European kestrels. And I succeeded in breeding them. And I thought, this is great. We can breed these beautiful little falcons. And then a few years later, I heard about the plight of the Mauritius kestrel, which in 1974 was the world's rarest bird, when the population declined to only 4 known wild individuals. And when I heard about this, I thought, wow, I can save that. I know how to breed kestrels. And so it became my dream to go to Mauritius and try and save the Mauritius kestrel. I finally got the job. It took several years of to convince various people that they should send this young, arrogant bloke from Wales to try and save the kestrel. But I was actually told that I would go to Mauritius for 1, possibly 2 years because, well, the kestrel was beyond saving, and really it wasn't a very good investment of money, and they didn't have a lot of money to save it anyway, and they wanted to hand the project over to the Mauritians so they could look after it. At the time, Mauritius had very little resources and certainly not much expertise for looking after endangered birds, so they wanted to turn their back on the species. Now, my bosses at the time deny they ever said that. However, those of you who look at the conservation biology literature from the 1970s will see that at the time people were arguing that we should leave the Mauritius kestrel and other critically endangered species become extinct. This is a quote from a very influential book that was published in 1979 by Norman Myers. Norman Myers, a very influential conservation biologist, one of the people who came up with the whole concept of hotspots. And he wrote, "We might abandon the Mauritius kestrel to its all but inevitable fate and utilize the funds to proffer stronger support for any of the hundreds of threatened bird species that are more likely to survive." My bosses at the time were saying it's a poor investment of money to put money towards trying to conserve something as rare as the Mauritius kestrel. And they argued that even if we could save the species, it would be unlikely to thrive because of inbreeding depression. Anyway, I persevered. And we established a captive breeding project for the Mauritius kestrel. And later, we developed techniques for the intensive management of the species in the wild. And we established the captive breeding project by harvesting eggs from the last wild pairs of Mauritius kestrels. And we knew that if we were to take the eggs early enough in the season, the adult birds would likely lay a second clutch of eggs. So we could actually double the potential productivity of the kestrels per year. We took the first clutch of eggs, hatched them in incubators, reared the young, and then we left the wild pairs to look after the second clutches. I should point out that we were using techniques that had been developed in this country by the Peregrine Fund. And we were very lucky to get funding and support from the Peregrine Fund that sent technicians out to Mauritius every year for 10 seasons to help us with the Mauritius kestrel. Aren't they beautiful? After we'd reared the birds and started to put them back into the wild, we provided nest sites. We continued brood and clutch manipulations to increase productivity. And of course, we did many reintroductions and translocations. I'm not going to go into any great detail over some of the bird recoveries because it just isn't the time, but I'll just give you an overview. And so, over a period of 10 years, we were able to reintroduce back into the wild 333 birds. And these we looked after by providing nest boxes, in some cases controlling predators, and certainly after the reintroductions, providing the birds with food until they were independent. The population increased very rapidly, and at one stage we had nearly 600 birds. However, in recent years, the population has declined somewhat to a much lower holding capacity of between 300 and 400 birds. But we think 300 to 400 birds is far better than extinction. And we can actually get the population up again with some more intensive management, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But anyway, this demonstrates that by using techniques that have been developed here with peregrines, we could get the population up. And we wanted to try some of these manipulative techniques in some of the other endangered species, so we worked with the pink pigeon. Similarly to the kestrel, it had a very small population, and it was in terminal decline. Population had declined due to habitat destruction, due to tropical storms, cyclones, and it seemed that the population was heading for extinction. We did various modeling at the time, and everything suggested that it would disappear about 2000, 2001 without any help. And by 1990, we had 9 or 10 individuals left. And we know there weren't more than that because all the birds were ringed and we never found any unringed birds. So something had to be done to try and prevent the extinction of this bird. And we were very lucky that we had, over a number of years, been brought in a small number of birds, had been brought into captivity, both at the Jersey Zoo and also in Mauritius, where we were able to breed them quite successfully. There was a great problem in getting compatible pairs because pink pigeons were very fussy about their mates, and we had to swap them around quite a lot. And one of the problems we had was that pink pigeons have very high divorce rates. And so they may well breed once, and then they split up. And so in my early years, I was essentially a marriage guidance counselor to pink pigeons. And at the time, people kept telling me about genetic management, and I said, well, we're trying our best, but the pigeons don't like each other. This is Pink. I have original names for my birds. But anyway, Pink was very choosy about his partners, and we eventually found a female that he liked, but we had 12 different pairings before we found a compatible pairing. This is actually quite an important lesson, and this is why many zoos are not very effective with many species, and it's because wild animals are selective about their partners. Domestic animals tend to be promiscuous. And this is true. When we actually domesticate animals, we choose for promiscuous animals. And this is why many zoo breeding programs are not successful, is because wild animals tend to be choosy about their partners. So if we are working on the captive breeding of endangered species, we need large numbers of individuals and dedicated breeding programs. Anyway, that's an aside. I tend to wander a little bit. But we were very successful in breeding pink pigeons. And over a decade, we bred many hundreds of birds. And we were able to release some of these birds into the wild and establish 7 subpopulations. Today we have 400 free-living birds, much better than none at all. However, what's really interesting is that these birds are going to need long-term management. We're going to need to look after them in the wild by feeding them and also by predator control. When we did our first reintroductions of captive bred pink pigeons, we found that there were seasonal food shortages, so that they needed feeding. We also found that the forests of Mauritius had large numbers of feral cats. These cats had been free in the forest for many centuries, living as wild animals, and they would kill the pigeons when they came down onto the ground to feed. And it's regrettable that one of the jobs that we have to do is to actually control these animals. But this is a problem we have on oceanic islands the world over. The 2 worst mammalian predators, or introduced mammalian predators, are cats and rats that have caused large numbers of extinctions. So although I like cats a great deal, on an island the only good cat is a dead cat. Sorry if I've offended you, but it's a reality. If we want to keep some of these wonderful endemic species, we've got to be hard about controlling or eradicating some of the introduced species. So we were successful with the pink pigeon. We were successful with the Mauritius kestrel. And we had another very rare bird species, the Mauritius parakeet. There are similar parakeets elsewhere in Asia, although this species is actually an endemic. It shows a number of characters which aren't shared by some of the Asian ones. And it's quite an important parakeet because throughout the islands of the Southwest Indian Ocean, there were several parrot species. And most of these have disappeared, and this is the last representative of a radiation of these green parakeets. It was critically endangered, and it seemed likely that it was going to be lost. We didn't know why it was rare. All we knew was there were a few birds flying around in the forest. And most conservation organizations wouldn't give us the resources to work on it because they felt, even though we'd been successful with the kestrel and the pigeon, they thought this parrot would be far more difficult. And they didn't think it was a good investment of money. But I was fortunate that we got small grants from an organization called the World Parrot Trust. We got support from the government of Mauritius and support from my own organization, Durrell. And we started off by doing very basic studies. Academics like questions, and they always talk about the quality of the question and how important the question is. But when you're working with species where very little is known, you have to start off with very basic questions. Natural history. And I tell all my staff and students, when you start with a species, the most important thing to do is know your species. Get to understand it. Think like it. Be intuitive about it. So our work with the echo parakeet involved a lot of clambering around, taking field notes, trying to understand the birds, collecting basic field data, numbers, distribution, and ecology. They're the foundations of the data you need. When we found nest sites, we only ever had about 1 or 2 pairs nesting in any year, and in some years we had none at all. We'd follow through the nest sites very carefully to see what was happening. There seemed to be a shortage of nest sites in the forest, so we put up nest boxes. We all know that nest boxes are great for increasing productivity when you have a shortage of natural nest cavities. But our parrots didn't recognize the nest boxes. It took them 20 years before we got a pair to nest in one of our boxes. That's another story. And we tried to feed them because we knew there were seasonal food shortages in the forest, but they didn't recognize the food we put out either, at least for many years. And we did disease studies. I'm not going to talk about disease today, but disease has proven to be very important, a very important limiting factor in many island species, including the parrots and the pigeons. And what we did was when we started to get a better handle on what the parrots were doing, we started to hire parrot biologists to work with us, and we twinned with a project in New Zealand. New Zealand at the time was working with a very rare parrot called the kakapo, a flightless nocturnal parrot. And we would exchange staff so we could exchange techniques, ideas, and so on. And we just loved working with New Zealanders. They're some of the best field workers in the world. You don't have to pay them very much. You put them in the forest and they can cope with the harshest condition. They don't seem to have any pain receptors as far as I can see. And certainly the ones I know, very few of them had social skills, but then that's another issue. I hope there's no New Zealanders here. Anyway, they've proven to be great friends, and without them we wouldn't have achieved what we have done with the echo parakeet. But the interesting point is that we were working with professionals that were working on their own parrot, and we were developing techniques together. Good information flow between Mauritius and another island country, New Zealand. We found that the nest sites were of very poor quality, so we used to enhance any nest site we found. We used to replace the substrate because very often it was waterlogged. We found that the young were dying in the nest because of parasites, tropical nest flies that were sucking all the blood out of our babies, so we treated the nests with insecticide. And we started to monitor very closely progress of eggs and chicks. And we found that even though echo parakeets would lay 3 or 4 eggs and hatch all the young, very rarely would they fledge any young, because the young would die in the nest, very often from starvation. And so we started to manage the nests intensively, climbing up to the nests, and any young that were not doing well, we'd feed them in the nest and rehydrate them in the nest. But if they lost a lot of weight, we'd harvest them and bring them into captivity. So this was intensive management of a wild population. Similar types of management that you'd do with captive parrots if they were being intensively cared for. And it worked exceedingly well. And we take these young parrots. Isn't that just beautiful? This is a healthy young parrot and a happy, healthy young parrot. They looked a lot worse than that when we rescued them. But we were very lucky that we had a Spanish vet who was absolutely magic when it came to looking after baby parrots. We hired her from a parrot breeding center in Tenerife, and she's a specialist vet. She's not just a parrot vet, but she's a parrot pediatrician. Now, there ain't many of those in the world. And she was wonderful because we could rescue these parrots and they'd be close to death, dehydrated, cold, emaciated, and she would rehydrate them, give them food, treat them if they had parasitic problems or what have you, and they'd bounce back. We then hand rear the young, and we used these young that we harvested from the wild to establish a captive population, and later on we'd release them back into the wild, but also look after them in the wild as well so the population could go up. So that's essentially what we did with the parrot, similar to what we'd done with kestrels and pigeons. We did captive breeding and reintroductions. Population went down to 12. We've done intensive management of the wild birds, and we have 650 free-living birds today. And the population is still going up. And last year we established a second population on Mauritius. So they're doing exceedingly well. However, similar to what we see with the pink pigeon, there's going to be a need for long-term management, providing them with food and giving them high-quality nest sites. But that isn't such a big price to pay for maintaining this very rare species. And it's the sort of thing we do in our back gardens. We provide nest boxes for birds in our gardens, and very often we feed them. But these types of techniques can be very potent with critically endangered species. Okay, so what we did was understand limiting factors and then correct those. Who is that person? Does anybody know? The most famous ornithologist of the 20th century. Came up with a theory of population regulation. Correct, David Lack. Excellent. Certainly students today, of course I'd expect you to know who he was, although he is a Brit from Oxford. David Lack published a book in 1954 about population regulation in vertebrates. And he argued that there were a small number of variables that controlled populations. That it was food, predators, competitors, disease, and breeding sites. Up until then, it had been a huge sort of argument in population biology. What was limiting populations of vertebrates? And various people were arguing different things. Some were saying it's social behavior, others were saying it was weather, and so on. But it was David Lack who put all the information together and came up with the first comprehensive theory of what regulated populations. Of course, because he's a Brit, very few Americans know anything about him. And Brits like to take the credit for the work on population biology. However, I have to admit something, that he was standing on the shoulders of an American, Aldo Leopold, who 2 decades before had suggested many of the same things in a more practical way. But anyway, the point is that by using population theory, understanding limiting factors, you can start to control those factors. And I tell my students, if a population is going down, or if a species is endangered, there are 2 things you've got to understand if you want to try and understand that rarity. Why it isn't breeding well enough, or why it isn't surviving well enough. So you've got to understand survival and productivity. And these are the factors that influence those 2 variables. So if you take it down to its basic factors, you can start to understand what's limiting your populations. You don't need to study it for 20 years. You just look at these variables. And very often it's obvious. There are seasonal food shortages, there are too many cats in the forest, or what have you. And as a captive breeding biologist that works in a zoo, I soon realized that when you're actually correcting limiting factors in a wild population, what you're doing is you're taking captive breeding type techniques and applying them to wild populations. If there are food shortages, you're feeding them. You're learning how to control predators and competitors. You're controlling transmission of disease. And in species that nest in holes, you're providing artificial nest sites. So essentially the same as what you do if you're running a captive breeding program, but your animals are in the wild. That's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but it's a way that works very, very well. So if we actually look at the 3 species that I've been involved with, you can see that by the correction of limiting factors, the populations have actually increased. This is the kestrel, the pigeon, the parrot. These graphs aren't quite up to date, but you can see the trajectory is upwards. Now then, here's all 3 species. I'm very proud of this graph. And a number of years ago, I was showing it to my bosses in Jersey. And I went and saw them, and I put the graph on the table, and I said, look at this. Look what we've done. Isn't this great? And they looked at the graph, and they looked at each other, and they didn't say very much. And then one of them shook his head, and he looked at me and he said, Carl, why did it take you so long? I said, what? He said, we've been working with these birds since the 1970s, and it's taken decades. And I said, oh. I wasn't very happy, so I thought about it. And I said, well, it just takes that long. And he said, well, we've got to be able to do it a lot quicker. So I thought about it, and I looked at a number of other recovery programs. In fact, I looked at every recovery program I could find. Hawaiian goose, kakapo, saddleback, Chatham Island black robin, California condor, whooping crane, and a whole range of others. They all show the same pattern. It takes decades of work before the populations start to recover. And in fact, I'm very pleased that my bosses pointed out that it does take a very long time to actually secure populations and getting them to increase. And this period here, where the population doesn't seem to do very much, you see that in virtually every species. And as a rough rule of thumb, it's about 10 times age of first breeding. So when we look at things like whooping cranes and California condors and kakapos, you can see there's been a long lead-in period of decades of just studying the birds, managing the birds, looking after them before we start seeing population increase. And there's a lot going on here. There's population biology. When populations are low, it's going to take quite a while for them to actually build up enough momentum to increase. There's also development of techniques. There's politics and so on. But I think there's a very important message. Yes, we can recover populations when they go very low, but we can't do it in 2 or 3 years. Most conservation projects today are only funded for cycles of 3 to 5 years, and then you've got to get another grant. And you write these grants promising that you're going to save the species in 3 to 5 years, and of course you can't do that. And I think we have to be a lot more realistic about how projects work and understand them a lot better. So there's a very important lesson there. And another lesson with endangered species is that we do need long-term management. Management of some sort is probably necessary while habitats are compromised. California condors, we have to feed them, and probably have to continue to feed them for the foreseeable future. Whooping cranes are being managed relatively intensively. But what we are doing is taking captive management techniques into the wild. And this is far superior than keeping them in captivity. Because when you keep animals in captivity long term, you start seeing the signs of domestication. They start changing genetically, and morphologically, and physiologically. Whereas if you've got free-ranging populations, they're fulfilling an ecological role, and they're still under some form of natural selection. So the future is to learn how to manage species in the wild rather than keep them in captivity. But something which is more important still is that when you work with species, it drives habitat restoration. All the cases, with all the species that we've worked with in Durrell, we see that we start with one species and very rapidly we start working with other species and then eventually work towards preserving the habitat that they live in. Now these techniques I've talked about work for a wide range of species. You can see that in Mauritius we've been successful with those 3 species, but we've actually been successful in averting possible or probable extinction in 9 vertebrates. 5 birds, 3 reptiles, and a fruit bat, as well as increasing many other species. So the potency of these techniques is very powerful. And if we look at Durrell programs worldwide, where we do use these types of techniques, we can see that the populations have increased. And what we've done in these cases is we've looked at the species we work with, and we look at other similar species where there wasn't conservation action, and we look at the difference in population change. And we see roughly a 67% increase in the value of the Durrell species compared to a 23% decrease in the counterfactual, those species that weren't managed. So we've got lots of evidence to show that it works in a wide range of vertebrates. But the important thing is that it drives the bigger agenda. I haven't talked much about reptiles, but we've also done a great deal, captive breeding and study of reptiles. And we were very keen that we should restore the island of Round Island, where several species of endemic reptiles were found. But the problem with Round Island was that it had been greatly modified by introduced exotic mammals, by rabbits and goats. This once verdant island, covered by vegetation, had been reduced to a bare rock with dying remnants of a palm savanna. This is what it looked like in the late 1970s. The palm trees are dying, the soil had been largely washed into the sea, and there were very few plants left growing on the ground, except for some odd tussock grasses. These are endemic tussock grasses which had survived grazing by rabbits and goats. Now then, if you have exotic animals on islands and you want to get rid of them, you need to hire some real wild men, some killers. So you need New Zealanders. I just love New Zealanders. They don't know what politically correct is, but anyway. Here they are. These were chosen for their lack of social skills, so they could survive on Round Island for 3 months to kill our rabbits. And that's what we did. We hired them, and they lived on the island for 3 months. This is Don Merton, who died a few years ago, who was very famous because he helped restore the kakapo, Chatham Island black robin, saddleback, and a range of other species, as well as developing the techniques for restoring islands. This is Norris, who came as a young man. He's now very high up in the Department of Conservation in New Zealand. And this gentleman who died last year is called Arab, a very famous wild man who lived in the forest. He was literally self-sufficient, but when people wanted to kill things on islands, they'd find him because he was such a good hunter. Anyway, that was our team. And I actually helped them. There's me, vain again, me as a young man. And here I'm with a rabbit. I mentioned earlier on about know your species. You also have to know the enemy. Okay, we were very successful in getting rid of the rabbits off Round Island. And the island started to regenerate very quickly. Rapid regeneration of some native plants. 1 or 2 species just came back very quickly. And you can see in that bottom picture, which is in roughly the same place as the top one, but 1 year apart, you can see plants beginning to cover the floor, creepers. And you can see them infringing upon the tussock grasses there. We also had huge regeneration of exotic plants. Weeds we'd never seen on the island before just came up everywhere. And we couldn't control the exotic plants. They were just too prolific. And we decided that what we really needed to do, because although there was some native regeneration, there were lots of plants which were missing. The rabbits and goats had been on the island for so long that a lot of the plants had not regenerated. The seed bank had become exhausted, and we would have to put the plants back. We tried going across on expeditions and planting various plants on the island, but it just wasn't very practical. So we built a small field station. We're very proud of this. Round Island is 25 miles off the north coast of Mauritius. There's no standing water. You can actually only get there by helicopter or by boat on a really calm day. And we decided that we'd put teams of people in there for a month at a time to set up a nursery to grow plants and to start restoring the vegetation on the island. We were hugely excited. This is a project we've been working towards for many years. And we were replacing the plants that we believed belonged there. And you can see young Mauritians that we employed, lots of volunteers. Working under very basic conditions, but you can see we set up a nursery, growing some native plants and planting them out on the island. We grew them from seeds and we took across young plants that we quarantined very carefully. In 2001 was the first year where we put back a substantial number of plants. 1,500 plants isn't a huge number, but for us, it was the start of our restoration program. So we were hugely excited, and we all felt very proud. Restoring the habitat for our rare reptiles. We monitored the plants very carefully, and they soon started to die. And within a year, they were all dead. We tried some more experiments, and very few survived. Even though we were watering them and looking after them to some extent, they were dying for all sorts of different reasons, but mainly they couldn't cope with the lack of water and the very high temperatures. So we decided that we were going to manage these plants and look after them and water them intensively until they became established. So we set up a water collecting system. We set up a dam to collect the rainwater. We then collected the water in large tanks, and we had a system of pipes going all over the island, so we could go and water the plants that we put out. And this is what we did. Still didn't work. And the problem was seabirds. Round Island is very famous because it's got seabird colonies there. And this bird is the wedge-tailed shearwater, quite a common tropical seabird. But Mauritius has the biggest population in the Indian Ocean. It's got about 60,000 pairs there. And they burrow in soil, and there's very little soil left. So wherever there's soil to put plants, they'd go and dig up the plants, inadvertently by making their nests. And so we sat down and thought, what can we do about the seabirds? And the botanists said, we've got the answer. And I said, what? And they said, it's obvious. Our plants are critically endangered endemics. Your seabird is a common tropical seabird in thousands. So we just kill the seabirds. Yeah. So I said, well, I don't think we can do that. We're meant to be ecologists. We're trying to think of ways of restoring functioning systems. So I said, I think we need to think this one through. And what we did was we decided that we would intensively manage the plants that we planted on the island in the same way that we've been intensively managing the birds by feeding them, providing them with nest sites, controlling predators. Let's have the same approach for the plants. So this is what we did. And all the plants we put out, we put them in cages. Put them in cages to keep them from the birds. Put shade netting around them to keep them nice and cool. Put mulch around them to keep the weeds down, and water them every day. And so that's what we've done. And it works. So we've done a lot of intensive management of our plants with watering, weeding, providing with shade, and so on. And survival, 2/3 of our plants survive to a year. And then after that, we don't have to manage them at all, and survival remains very high. And since we've started this work nearly 15 years ago, we now have plants 20 feet high, flowering and fruiting. So the forest is coming back. Weeding and replanting a Mauritius forest, and it works. And as a result, we've seen massive increases in the endemic reptiles on the island. There's two Phelsuma geckos there for you, Jonathan. And the round island boa and the tailfish skink. So we were very happy. However, although the palm savanna has started to come back, this is what it looked like in the 70s when there were rabbits and goats. This is taken in exactly the same place in 2015. You can see wonderful regeneration of the palm savanna. Didn't quite go as smoothly as that, because although the palms came back, the grasses and herbaceous plants, which are endemics, have declined. So the tussock grasses that you saw in the first pictures, nearly all gone, been swamped by exotic plants. And many small herbaceous plants have dwindled the populations have dwindled and have nearly disappeared. So we started to look at these plants very carefully, and we could see that they had adaptations for living with grazers. They'd survived with rabbits and goats, although not very well, but they were still there with the rabbits and goats. But they survived because they had prostrate growth forms, and they spread along the ground to avoid excessive grazing. And they'd respond to trampling, and they could cope with trampling. And we felt, well, these plants were part of a grazing climax plant community. And we needed to bring back and restore a grazer on the island. And when we looked at it, of course, the grazers weren't rabbits and goats because they'd been introduced by early sailors. The grazers were, in fact, tortoises. And we looked back at the historical accounts, and we found that Mauritius had two species of tortoises. They had a browsing tortoise and they had a grazing tortoise. And when we looked at the plants, we saw all these adaptations for living with browsers and grazers. And so we thought about how can we replace these extinct tortoises. And I suggested, well, we just bring in another species of tortoise. And when I suggested it, all my colleagues said, you must be mad. You can't bring exotics to islands because they cause all the problems. And I said, but we're doing it slightly differently. And they said, no, this is ridiculous. Anyway, we thought about it for 20 years, and I was able to convince them that it might be a good idea. And what we did, it was really quite interesting, because I worked with some very good botanists who were interested in interactions between animals and plants. And we started to think about what were the adaptations that our plants showed. And we came up with a long list of species that seemed to have co-evolved with tortoises and had various adaptations for living with tortoises. And we found that many plants could cope with grazing and trampling. In fact, there are lots of Mauritian plants, when they're seedlings, you can step on them and they bounce back. We also noted that lots of trees had various adaptations to avoid browsing by this beautiful long-necked tortoise. And also we speculated there'd be a lot of seed dispersal by the tortoises. So we argued there was a need for an ecological replacement. We couldn't get money from conservation organizations because they all said it was too out there. It wasn't really a high priority. But we did get money from the universities of Zurich in Switzerland and the University of Bristol in England. And they gave us money for a PhD study because they thought it was really important that we actually examine this whole issue of ecological replacement. And we started our work by a series of studies on another island, the island of Îles Aigrettes, which is a nature reserve that we managed. And we released tortoises on the island, and we had areas where they could go and areas where they couldn't and so on, so we could look at impact. And we put Aldabra tortoises. We also used radiated tortoises as a comparison, but I won't talk anymore about the radiators because essentially we have stuck with Aldabra tortoises. We put the Aldabra tortoises on the island, and one of the first things they did was to go and start eating the fallen fruits of the endemic ebony. Now this ebony tree, the best population is on this island, and it wasn't regenerating. Very rarely would we ever see a baby tree. And there was certainly no evidence of recent dispersal. And soon they'd eat the fruit, and they'd be passing the seeds in their droppings. So we'd see the droppings just full of ebony seeds. Then a few weeks later, we'd see this. All these young ebony trees coming up. You could stamp on those and they just bounce back again. They were just adapted to living with tortoises. And we started to look at what was happening. And we mapped the distribution of all the ebony trees. The adult ebony trees are the black spots, and there was no regeneration, or very little regeneration until we put the tortoises back, and certainly no regeneration away from the parent trees. And soon we started to see young trees coming up all over the island, being spread by the tortoises, providing good empirical evidence that tortoises are seed dispersers and would have been historically. And we also started to look at germination rates. And when we took these seeds and put them in the nursery, those that hadn't gone through a tortoise showed very, very poor germination and very poor growth. But those that had passed through a tortoise just did exceedingly well. There were many other signals showing how tortoises improved the vegetation, but this was one of the most dramatic. But it convinced us that it was actually important to have tortoises to actually help the vegetation. So then we've taken the story a step further, and more recently, we have put the tortoises on Round Island. It's still in the early stages, and we have a population that we're studying on Round Island, and we're also working with the University of Zurich that are studying the tortoises on Aldabra, the true wild tortoises, so we can do a compare and contrast. And we've got some very long-term studies looking at the impact of tortoises on vegetation. It's still in the early days, but we've already seen that the tortoises are having a beneficial impact on what vegetation there is on Round Island. The tortoises are eating the exotic grasses. They're creating tortoise lawns, grazed areas in which many of the native plants are coming back. And they're also spreading the seeds of pandanus and palms, which are coming back in profusion. We've put 516 giant tortoises on the island. Most of them are quite small, so it's not that big a job. But we now have some 20-year-old animals on the island, which should be breeding in the next year. And in the grazed areas, the tortoises avoid the endemic tussock grasses because they've got very fibrous leaves, and they're coming back in profusion. So although it's still early days, we're seeing the reactivation of the relationship between tortoises and the vegetation. And some plants that seem doomed to extinction are now beginning to recover. So, this is a very controversial type of approach, but it's working. And we now want to develop this further. And in the next few years, we want to put on Round Island a browsing tortoise. And of course, there is a species of browsing tortoise which you still get in Galapagos. We'd like to find flightless rails, similar to the ones that existed in Mauritius. And also bring back some of the missing seabirds. We've already experimented in releasing seabirds on Île aux Aigrettes. We've put 6 species back. But there's one seabird, a very large booby or gannet, which existed in the Western Indian Ocean until the 1840s. It's disappeared from the Western Indian Ocean, and there's a population that exists on Christmas Island north of Australia, and we'd like to bring that back. So you can see that even in very disrupted systems, there are possibilities for bringing back species to fill the role of species that have become extinct. So even in a system as modified as what we see in Mauritius, where you'd think that the ecology has been lost and a lot of the interactions have gone forever, we can actually start reactivating some of these relationships using what I call ecological replacements. The world is now hugely modified, and we're seeing massive climate change. We don't know what the future holds, but it's quite clear that any attempt to turn the clock back is not going to work. There's just been too much change. So we have to think about how we preserve what biodiversity we have. And I believe that in the future we will be rebuilding systems, sometimes in very different places to where they occur now. And sometimes those systems are not going to be exactly as they were before, because there's going to be different elements in them. But these are the types of approaches which I think can work very, very well. And instead of trying to replicate history exactly, we've got to try and think about how we can actually preserve the maximum of biodiversity in functional systems. So I started off by talking about the conservation of 1 or 2 critically endangered species. And I've shown just how that work has moved on to learning how to manage the species in the wild, and how that work can actually drive the much bigger agenda of preserving habitat and rebuilding systems. And I think this shows there is great hope. There is too much doom and gloom in the world when it comes to conservation. Everybody's telling us about what we're going to lose, but I'm an optimist. I believe we can save more species, but we just have to do it. We have to learn the techniques. And I think that this modest example is showing the types of things that we will be doing in the future. So I'd like to finish by saying that conservation works. It takes decades to save species. There's no quick fix, and possibly centuries to restore ecosystems. But I think there is great hope, and most species are savable. Thank you very much.